This afternoon we're going to be doing the backup and offsite special of the Veeam Availability Suite version 9.5. Now, the Veeam Availability Suite, just to introduce it a little bit, it provides availability for the always-on enterprise, and we do this with 5 key points: high-speed recovery, data loss avoidance, verified recoverability, leveraged data, and complete visibility. Now, the Availability Suite is made up of 2 products. It's made up of Veeam Backup and Replication, which allows us to go out to our virtual machines and agentlessly pull backups and replicas of those VMs. Now, we work on VMware and Hyper-V. The other part of our Availability Suite is Veeam One. Now, Veeam One provides monitoring, reporting, alerting, and capacity planning for our whole virtual world. So for VMware, Hyper-V, and of course, Veeam Backup and Replication. Now, we're going to be diving into one of those key points this afternoon, and that is data loss avoidance. This is the backup side of the Veeam Availability Suite. So we're going to talk about backup files, how we create the jobs, what components are used, how we can keep our data safe by taking it off-site, what about long-term archives, how can I keep track of what I have where, and of course some of those new features that we're introducing in 9.5, so that if you were a fan of version 9, hey, this is some of the stuff that's hot and new in the product. Of course, what demonstration would be complete without actually showing a backup? So let's do one. In fact, I'm going to show you all of the different options we have of running backups using Veeam Backup and Replication. So this is my main Veeam Backup Server console right now. I'm going to go in here and I'm going to take a quick look. Now, we're currently in the stage of deploying a new Exchange server. Something went a little odd with it. Now, this is the new one, and well, you know what? I want to grab an extra backup of this particular machine right now before we go through and do the next step of our testing. So this is a VM, it's a little Exchange server. We're still getting it up and going. Now, I could do a Veeam zip. Now, what the Veeam zip is going to do is it's going to go out to that Exchange server. It's going to grab all the blocks of data and put them into a backup file in a location that I specify. Now, this means that we're going to be grabbing everything. We're going to grab all those pieces of data, which can take a bit of time. So what I want to run today is a quick backup. Now, quick backup is a nice, handy little tool. What quick backup lets us do is it takes a look, and I chose this particular Exchange server. Now, it's going to go through my job list. It's going to find a job that is backing up this virtual machine, and it's going to run an incremental run of this job just for the one VM. Now, this is really handy because when I set up my jobs, I actually put, I think there's probably about, I think there's 4 VMs plus a folder full of VMs that's actually doing the backup of, that includes this particular virtual machine, this APAC Lab server. You can see the name at the very top. Now, if you think that this looks a little bit different than what you can see in your environment, it might just be that your details are hidden, so you may want to show the details. Now, this is going to run a very quick backup of just this one virtual machine, and you can see here it's doing the application-aware processing right now. Now, I'm going to press OK and show you the 2 other options that we have for running backups in Veeam Backup and Replication. Okay, I'm going to look at a slightly different job. I'm going to look at my little workers job here. If I click on Start, this is going to run an incremental run of this particular job. So I'm going to go out, I'm going to grab the changes from all of the VMs that are inside of this job. In this case, there's, it looks like about 10, 12 VMs there. We're going to grab all of those. We're going to create the necessary backup files following the rules that we've defined when we created this particular backup job. So this basically just runs maybe what you might consider an out of schedule run of this job, or if we didn't schedule at all, then hey, maybe it's just the run of the job. The other option is the active full. Now, active full is going to go out to all of the VMs in this job. It's going to grab all the blocks of data from those VMs, and it's going to create a new full backup. Now, we run active fulls by default on the first run of every backup job that we create because, well, hey, we need that starting point. But beyond that, we're only going to run the increments. Now, let's take a quick look and see how that job is running. So you can see here, this is the incremental job that's running right now. It's sitting at 0%. It's going to take a little bit of time, but it's going to take a lot less time than if I did a backup that included all the VMs or doing that active full of that whole virtual machine. So it's nice and quick, a very handy little tool, especially when you're doing experimentation, or maybe, you know, something you're a little concerned about. Maybe it won't go quite the way you're expecting. You want that extra safety net? It's a very handy little safety net to have. Okay, so we're going to let this continue to run, and we're going to pop back into the slides. We will come back and look at it a little bit later on. But that is the quick backup. We're actually running a backup live in this demo this afternoon. Okay, let's look at how we set up those backup jobs and take a quick look and see how the quick backup job that we ran earlier, well, how that went. So I'm going to go to backup, and this is the job that we ran as the quick backup. Let's just take a quick look at the statistics. And you can see here that, there we go, it looks like it completed successfully. If I click on the name of this VM, it actually shows me what was happening during the run of this job. Now in this case, it's a little bit silly because there was only the one VM in this job. But if there had been multiple VMs, I could actually see the process for each of the virtual machines. One thing to note is this busy line. This indicates where we put our effort in. Now in my case, the source was 95%, the proxy was 72, the network was 49, and the target was 1. That probably means that if I want to optimize things just a bit, I might want to take a look and see what's happening in my VMware environment, see how I'm able to connect to that VM when I do the backups, because I'm getting into trouble with the source. It's not that I'm in trouble, it's just a matter that I'm spending a lot more effort there than anywhere else. So it's probably where I can get the biggest bang for my buck, let's say. Okay, let's take a look at how we actually set up this job. Now the first page is going to show me the name of the job and the description. We automatically populate the description. We do put in a name, but I would probably change it. The next tab is the virtual machines, and you're able to choose specific VMs. So I've actually chosen 4 specific VMs, and I also chose a container object. Now these container objects can be really handy to use, because as we add or remove VMs from our environment, we can automatically have them being protected by Veeam Backup and Replication. So when if I want to add a container object, I just choose that specific container. So in my case, I chose a VMware folder. I could choose all the VMs that are on a specific data store. I could choose a certain resource pool. I can do all kinds of different things. Maybe I want to choose all the VMs that are in this particular cluster. Okay, I'm able to do that if it makes sense to my environment. Now, one of the nice things is how flexible this is. We are able to actually pick and choose which VMs are in the job, so we're able to set different rules for different VMs. Now, we can set up exclusions if we've got a container and maybe there's some VMs inside of that container that don't belong in this job. Maybe we want to exclude them. We can also exclude certain disks. Just make sure you're not excluding the OS disk. And we can choose whether or not we're going to process the templates. Now the storage, we can choose which proxy we're going to use to do this work, or we can use the automatic selection. We choose the backup repository where the data is going to sit at rest, and I am sending my data into a scale-out repository, so I'm letting Veeam take care of choosing which of my extents the VMs are going to sit in. I can choose a number of restore points, and you might be looking at this going, 4? This demo environment's really quite poor if it's only got 4. Well, to be honest, I'm only keeping 4 restore points in my primary backup. I've got a secondary backup which has a much longer retention that's sitting on some deduplicating storage. Now this is a handy way to architect the solution. My primary location is nice and fast. I'm able to do recoveries from it. I've got those recent points in time available to me. I'm able to test them using Sure Backup. I can do a lot of things from the primary location, and then I send it off onto my deduplicating storage using a backup copy job, which we're going to talk about towards the end of the session. And I'm going to store my more long-term archives out on that secondary location. So, little footprint for my local backup, and then a long-term solution off using the backup copy job. So you can see that there are secondary destinations configured, but before we do that, I want to take a look at the advanced settings, show you where you can set up those backup modes. So, I am currently using a forward incremental with a synthetic full. If I want to do the forever incremental, all I need to do is untick that box and make sure that there's no active full also being created. So this is a forward incremental with a synthetic full. If I wanted to turn on the transform, I could choose that right here. As I said, it's a little bit hard on the storage, so I'm not going to do that. Now, if I want to choose reverse incremental, you just choose the reverse, and it does give you the heads up that, hey, it is a bit slower. It's a bit more work on that storage. Maintenance, storage level corruption guards, backup file maintenance. Hey, I was mentioning that we're able to look at a container and grab all the VMs from that container. Well, if I remove a VM from that container, I might want to keep that data around for a while, maybe say a month, but after that I'm okay with it getting deleted from my backup files. So this actually gives us that extra chance, just in case, so that we're protected for an extra month beyond the time the VM was deleted. We can choose to defragment and compact the full backup. Heads up on this, it will take a bit more space on your storage device because we're going to have to create a new full while we're doing this. So just a heads up. Storage, do we want to enable our inline data deduplication? How about excluding things like swap blocks and deleted file blocks? Basically, we're not going to be able to use those when we go to do a recovery, so there's no point in grabbing them for a backup. We do have 5 different compression levels. None and dedupe friendly are meant for our deduplicating storage devices. Optimal is what we recommend for most environments. High does create about a 10% smaller backup file, which sounds great, but it comes at a 10 times processing cost, so maybe not so great. But if you've got the processing and you're lacking in the storage, maybe it's an option. Optimal is another 3% beyond high, or I should say extreme is another 3% beyond high. Storage optimization is the size of block that we're looking at. So when we look for deleted blocks or swap blocks, or when we're doing our deduplication, the smaller the block size that we look at, the more we're going to be able to reduce what we're pulling. However, the smaller the block, the more blocks we have to look at, so it can take up a fair bit more time. So it's all a trade. The biggest blocks are the local target 16 terabyte plus backup files. The smallest are the WAN target, and they go in that specific order. We can choose to encrypt the data as it sits at rest in the backup repository. This is where we can enable that. We're also able to encrypt the data in flight between the proxy and the repository. If that's an issue, that is in our network, general network settings. Notifications. Hey, do you want to send an SNMP notification or an email notification? vSphere integration, do you want to use the VMware Tools quiescence? You might want to do this on Linux VMs, but for the most part we want to use the application-aware processing that gets into our Microsoft VMs. It also gets into Oracle databases to get them into a safe-to-backup state. Use of change block tracking is encouraged and recommended because it basically shortens our backup window. We're going to ignore any blocks of data that we've already got. Hey, why would we bother, right? Integration is a VMware specific capability, and this gets into our relationship with some of our special storage partners, where we're able to use those storage devices and the snapshot capabilities within the storage devices to take some of the effort of the backup away from the host. Now, Nimble, NetApp, HPE, and Dell EMC are the 4 vendors, and there are specific models from each of those vendors where we can do the backup from storage snapshots, which is what this integration is talking about. Scripts are scripts to run before and after the job. Secondary target, as I said, sending my data off to a deduplicating storage appliance using the backup copy jobs. You can see right there, that's that secondary job. Guest processing is where I'm able to get into those VMs and give them that little heads up. Now, I do like to show one extra little feature in here, and that is the transaction log processing. So within our jobs, we can choose whether or not we're using the application-aware processing, whether we're going to handle the transaction logs, and then for our SQL and Oracle databases, we introduce a bonus job. Now, this bonus job is available in backups only, and what it's going to do, it's going to go out on a regular schedule outside of those image-based backups and grab the data from the transaction logs that SQL and Oracle provides. Now, this allows us to use the Veeam Explorer for SQL and Oracle to do that transaction level recovery, and in fact the point-in-time recovery also. So it can be a very handy little tool, getting those transaction logs during the day, and then maybe taking our SQL or our Oracle database image backup off into the evening where it's a little bit safer. It's also available for Oracle. We can do file exclusions. I suggest going light on this one. The capability is there by popular demand. However, it can increase your backup window. And scripts are scripts that we want to run before or after backing up this specific virtual machine. Now, enabling guest file system indexing, this goes through our virtual machine, creates an index of all the guest files within it, makes our restores of guest files a little bit faster. It can also help us in the Enterprise Manager in being able to dive in and find a file from a VM that we don't know actually which VM it is. The schedule is when we're going to run the job. I'm running it daily, but of course you could run it anything down to the 15-minute interval. You can actually run it continuously, but maybe 15 minutes is pretty reasonable. We have retries and backup windows so that we're not interfering with production. So that is the options in setting up a backup job. Now let's take a look at using Veeam 1 reports in order to keep an eye on what's happening inside of backup and replication. Now, this is the Veeam 1 reporter. My Veeam 1 server is actually installed on a different system, but it's a web interface, so hey, I'm able to go from here. Now, the first thing I want to mention are the infrastructure assessment reports. Now, I strongly encourage you to install Veeam 1 and run the infrastructure assessment reports before you start to take your first backup. For example, the data store performance assessment that we have here. I mentioned before, that first run of the job, we're going to go out to the VM, we're going to grab everything. Now that's a lot of data to pull off of that data store. And if we're pulling a lot of data off that data store, our data store might not be very happy with us. We do have capabilities to limit how much data we're pulling to give it a little bit, maybe give it a little bit of grace, so that we're not having quite so much impact on those data stores. It's nice to know if our data stores are struggling in advance before we go to do that first backup. We can get our change rate estimation. This actually looks at our VMs and determines how much data is going to sit in those incremental backups. You know, we can pull a number out of midair and say, oh, our VMs are changing 20%. But that's just a number we're pulling out of the air. I always like to have real numbers. This is the real value. This uses the change block tracking in order to determine how much our VMs are changing. By the way, uses change block tracking in the VMware environment, Hyper-V 2016 and resilience change tracking. For the earlier versions of Hyper-V, you do need to make sure that you have Veeam Backup and Replication installed in order to leverage Veeam's change block tracking that we created for Hyper-V. We have a configuration assessment report that takes a look at the VMs and maybe looks for things like old versions of the VMware tools, and for some other problems with the VMs themselves that may cause our backups to struggle a little bit. On the Hyper-V side, we also have infrastructure assessment. We have the change rate estimator, as I mentioned before, and the configuration and performance assessment. We know that there are a lot of Hyper-V environments out there where some of the things that we've learned on VMware just didn't quite translate, and we put together some assessment reports to help you get more out of that Hyper-V environment. Now, of course, when you're doing your backups, you want to keep track of what you've got. So maybe you want to take a look at your backup inventory, but maybe more importantly is the protected VM's job schedule. So what do my jobs look like? Now, my environment here actually has 3 Veeam backup servers that are communicating with this one Veeam 1 instance. So just so that you understand why you might see a little bit more than you'd expect to. Now, some of the other reports that I would like to point out in Veeam 1 are things like the tape reports. Now, down here, the tape media retention period, this gives us an idea of the media that we may need to be pulling back when we're using tapes as our offsite location. And tape exportation gives us some information about those tapes that we've exported out. Now let's take a look at our protected VM job schedules. And I always like to actually look at tables. I mean, you know, pie charts are nice and pretty, and some managers might like them, but I'd prefer to see the real numbers. Give me some real pieces of data, retention policies, backup copy, all kinds of bits and pieces of those VMs that I have in my environment. This is the schedule of when they run and what time. So VMware, Hyper-V, all in one place. I'm able to see what's happening throughout that environment as a whole. Let's actually go and take a look at tape. Now the tape infrastructure sits down here. Just a heads up, the first thing that you need to do is you need to add a Windows server to hold that tape server role. Once you've done that, then you go into tape infrastructure, you add your tape server, then you can choose the files to tape job, the backup to tape job, or to do the restores. Now you can create your media pools. Now I have 2 different media pool types here. I have a regular media pool and a GFS media pool. Now GFS, well, let's take a look at a regular one first. Now you can see here that there's a number of tapes inside of it. These are actually the tapes. We can choose to pull tapes automatically from the free media pool when we need them. So if we're running low on tapes, we can actually pull them. We choose our media set and we choose when we're going to create the new ones. So in my case, I'm doing it daily at midnight, just on Mondays, so that I'm able to take the weekend's tapes home with me on Monday afternoon. Not quite sure what I'm going to do on Easter Monday yet. Now, retention is how long I'm going to wait before I reuse this tape. In my case, I'm going to protect my data for 4 weeks before I start to reuse it. If I choose to take a tape offline, I'm able to continue to track it inside of a media pool that's a special one called the Vault. Now, there are some options such as enabling parallel processing and using encryption. By the way, if you encrypt using the tape encryption, it'll probably be a bit faster. I'm just double checking to make sure I didn't miss anything. Yep, that's all good. So that's the creation of a regular media pool. The GFS media pool is a little bit different. What it is creating the grandfather, father, son style of retention. I know, sounds sexist. But it is creating the weekly, monthly, quarterly, and yearly full copies that sit off onto tape that are probably not overwritten very often, but kept just in case. So the GFS media pool looks a little bit like this, pretty much the same so far, but we're going to choose how long we're going to protect the weekly, monthly, quarterly, and yearly sets. There are some advanced options here, and that is where we're able to specify the specific tapes for those GFS options. Again, we can choose to use encryption. Now, just taking a look at these tapes for a second, you'll notice one thing, and that is the capacity. Now, my tape capacity is very, very tiny, which is not terribly realistic. However, the one thing I like to let you know about is if we're sending our backups to tape, we've already compressed and deduplicated them as we sent that into the disk-based repository. So turning on the tape compression is not going to give us the great results because it's going to sit there, it's going to try to compress already compressed data. It's going to try, it's going to spend a lot of effort and not really give any results. So we do recommend not using the tape compression when we're sending our Veeam backup files to tape. If you're sending regular files to tape, if you like, go for it. Obviously, compressed files are not going to compress any further, though. We can see our tape servers here and our tape libraries. Now that's the creation of the tape infrastructure. When we send our tape jobs, we can set up our tape jobs. By the way, this is the only part of Veeam Backup and Replication where you can mix VMware and Hyper-V together, because we're just taking those files and writing them off onto tape. We're able to actually mix the two. So you're able to take backups from both VMware and Hyper-V. So you choose your backup files. You can choose from jobs or from repositories. You can choose your full backup if you're sending that to tape, and if it is a forever incremental, you can choose when you're creating those virtual synthesized full backups. We can choose if we're going to send the increments to tape. We don't have to. If you don't want to send them, you don't have to. You can also choose to send them to a different media pool if you want to set a different retention. We can choose to eject the media when the job completes, or export the current media set when this job completes. There are some advanced settings, notifications. This is where you could turn on the hardware compression, but as I said, for backup files, it's not going to give you the greatest experience. You can also choose to process the latest full backup chain only. So instead of sending everything you've got on disk onto tape, we can just send that latest chain. And of course we can run scripts before or after the job. The schedule is when we're going to run the job. And if we want to get data off of tape, if we're doing it, it's going to come off in the same format as we pulled it, as we wrote it onto the tapes. So if we sent backups to tape, we're going to pull back backups from tape. If we sent files to tape, we're going to pull back files from tape. Okay, that's the Veeam 1 server, not what I was looking for. Let's go to Backup and Replication and take a look at the backup copy job. Now the first thing you need for the backup copy job is the destination repository. It's going to be a secondary repository at potentially another location. It could be local too. We don't say that it has to be remote. That backup repository is going to sit in that offsite location. If we want to deploy WAN accelerators, we can do that from here. Now, in order to deploy a target WAN accelerator, we need the Enterprise Plus edition. If we want to send our data up to a Cloud Connect service provider partner using the backup copy job, we only need to deploy the source side one. And we're going to talk about Cloud Connect in a minute. So you need to deploy out your repositories, and then you create your backup copy job. Now we're going to take a look at one of these. I'm going to take a look at this backup copy job right here. Oh, that's interesting. Somebody's created a new VM on me. Okay, so we've got the backup copy job. Now one of the superpowers of the backup copy job is down here in this copy interval. Now, copy interval, just a little bit different. What this is saying is how often am I going to create a restore point in that remote repository. Let's say I'm doing a backup every hour in production, but I only need a daily at the second location. This can help me take those 24 restore points from production and create just that one daily at the remote location. Now you can choose which VMs you're pulling from. The only requirement on this is that they're all using the same compression and block size. You can set up exclusions. You can choose the source. And then your target, this is the second backup repository, the number of restore points that you're going to keep in that main chain, and if you want to turn on the GFS archives. Now there are some advanced options, corruption guards, very similar to what we saw in the backup file. There is an option here, read the entire restore point from the source backup instead of synthesizing it from increments. What this is going to do is instead of having a forever incremental as my chain at the secondary location, I'm actually going to have a forward incremental. It's going to take a lot more bandwidth to send that data across, but we're not having to do synthetic operations on it, and that can be helpful on things like deduplicating storage or maybe cloud storage. Data transfer is either going to be direct or through the WAN accelerators. And the schedule, it's going to run all the time, but you can set up times where it's not allowed to run. So during work hours, I said, hey, you know what? No backup copies happening. That is the creation of the backup copies. As far as it goes to do recoveries from those, you just use a regular repository. They may be a little bit slower because we're pulling it back from a further distance, but it's a regular repository where we're able to do the recoveries from. Now the last thing to talk about in our demo this afternoon is Cloud Connect. Now what if we don't want to maintain a second location as a destination for our backup copy jobs? Well, we could actually send our data up to a Cloud Connect service provider and have them provide the storage location for our backup files. So they have their own little Veeam environment with a Veeam backup server with a Cloud Connect license where they're able to deploy their cloud repository. They have a cloud gateway, and that allows us to send our backups up to them without having to create a VPN. Now we control what data we're sending up there. We can use that backup copy job. We can also use WAN acceleration. As I mentioned before, if you're running the Enterprise Edition and your service provider offers WAN acceleration, you can do WAN accelerated backup copy jobs to that location. You can do direct, if your service provider allows it, direct backup. However, this doesn't follow the 3210 rule. And, well, it can be a bit slow, so maybe not the greatest idea in the world. So they have a cloud repository. It's basically a regular repository that's divided for each of their tenants. So each of their customers has their own little space within that repository. Now this does bring me to the end of the session. If there are Any questions, pop them into the GoToWebinar question window. Thank you very much. Have a perfectly wonderful day.